Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin. I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion entitled The U.S. Presidential Election and the Future of Democracy, jointly hosted by Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House, the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, Social Science Research Center, and the American Academy in Berlin. This evening, we have an extraordinary group of scholars who have come together, and many of them are well known to you, but let me just briefly introduce them. First, we have Rainer Forst. Rainer Forst is professor of political theory and philosophy at Goethe University in Frankfurt. His research focuses on questions of justice, democracy, and tolerance, as well as critical theory and practical reason in the tradition of Kant. Christoph Möllers is a lawyer and professor of public law and philosophy of law at Humboldt University here in Berlin. He has previously taught in Münster and Göttingen, and he has served as a part-time judge at the Higher Administrative Court of Berlin-Brandenburg, and also represented both chambers of the German parliament as well as the federal government before the German Constitutional Court. Susan Neiman, my fellow American on this panel, is a professor of moral and political philosophy, currently serving as the director of the Einstein Forum, an international and interdisciplinary think tank in Potsdam. A graduate of Harvard, she has taught at Tel Aviv University and at Yale. She's published extensively in English and German. Her most recent book is entitled Learning from the Germans. Finally, here with me at the WCB is Michael Zorn, who is a professor of international relations at the Freie Universität Berlin and director of the Department of Global Governance here at the WCB. So he is, additionally, I should say, the founding dean of the Hertie School of Governance and the school's first honorary fellow. He has also taught at Bremen. So it's been an extraordinary few days in what is now commonly referred to as election week. We no longer have election day. And I'd like to start off by asking all of you a question that you can each answer in your own way. And in some ways, I'll be particularly interested to see what our three German panelists have to say, because they are supposed to be working together right now at the Villa Aurora in Los Angeles on a book on the legitimacy of public powers, the connection between morality, law, and politics. And so that assumes that they are more or less in the same place, but we'll see when we ask this question. So my beginning question is, and I'll start off with Rainer Forst, if I might, what has this election done to the image of America in Germany and in the world? And let me just preface it by saying it's been an extraordinary thing to watch. Weeks of people lining up and expressing their democratic determination and voting in numbers that haven't been seen, or in masses that haven't been seen since 1900. And on the other hand, I think many people here in Europe would say yes, but almost half of them voted for Donald Trump. So what is your takeaway from this election?
Thank you very much. Thanks for this question, and thanks for having me tonight. Well, I think it is a mixed message. I think many of us are relieved that it looks as if now Joe Biden will be able to win the 2 more states that he needs in order to win this election. I think with on the one side, there is huge relief. It looks as if the Senate will remain dominated by Republicans, which of course lets us anticipate that many of the structural problems, the obstruction that goes on between Democrats and Republicans will also go on while Joe Biden takes over the presidency. But the larger question, of course, is about the image that we get from American democracy during these days. And here, I think, a lot depends on what is happening at the moment. People couldn't really be surprised about Donald Trump's behavior when he declared himself the real victorious person in this race, because we know that Donald Trump creates his own reality and is actually quite successful in doing so. So the reality making is still going on, because now his people are out in several states trying to show that irregularities have taken place. So, I think there is a lot of stress on the procedures at the moment, but we can all be, well, we'll see how it works. But I think I'm not really pessimistic that procedures will survive these attacks. And my optimism might go too far, but I think Donald Trump's moves at the moment, right in election night and these 2 days, have been so overly strategic that he might be at a point where he's overdoing it, and also at the point where he loses the election, as I said when I started.
Okay, Christoph Millers, what do you think the election has done to the image of America? Strengthened it? Harmed it? It's a complicated picture.
It's quite complicated, and obviously very much depends on the expectations you had. You know, when we think that we were talking about riots and strikes and uncivil action on the streets before Election Day, I think it was a rather smooth process, you know, according to that standards. And it was in many parts of the country very well organized. Look at Florida, how quick they came up with the results. So that I would be a little bit hesitant to just damn the process. The process went very well. And I think when you look at the process, you have somehow to abstract from the result. And given the fact that we have no observing American elections for quite a while, and we all remember Bush v. Gore and the 2000 election, I think even the strategic take on, you know, litigation and the very aggressive way of fighting for every vote is something not totally unusual, not to talk about 19th century and other elections. So therefore, I cannot say that I'm shocked, and I'm always a little bit irritated by especially Germans or continental Europeans who are somehow thinking that they have somehow, you know, this kind of subscription to the rule of law and how it is plays out in democratic elections. I think so far we can talk about Trump, we can talk about polarization, but with the very exception of Trump claiming the victory yesterday, which was obviously a great, very problematic thing to do, everything else seemed to me, in a way, better than expected and totally acceptable from a procedural point of view. So therefore, well, you know, we see what happens, but I think for a constitutional lawyer, the fall from grace was 2000. And it cannot get worse than a court delivering an election in a certain way. So I'm at the moment quite moderate with regard to my judgment.
Susan,
shaking her head.
As an American abroad, acutely sensitive to the image of America, what's your verdict on how this process has affected America's image?
Yeah, I've got to push back against some of the things that Christoph Müller said, because first of all, yes, it's true. We were worried about large-scale violence. It ain't over, as Joe Biden would say. We don't know what might happen with a president who makes open calls for violence. You know, so we don't know what would happen. Secondly, Bush v. Gore was a very different situation. First of all, as I and many people learned from Bart Gellman's article in The Atlantic, which was read by a lot of places, the court did not deliver the election. Trump thinks it did, which is why he was in a rush to appoint Amy Barrett. But in fact, Gore would have had lots of avenues open to him. He decided, because he still held himself to democratic norms and he didn't want to increase the polarization in American society, he conceded. But there were other things he could have done. So the court didn't deliver it. But what's different about Bush v. Gore is Bush was basically an unknown. Nobody thought he was going to start the war in Iraq and various other things that he did. What I find, and I have to say, I find it really devastating, is the fact that 68 million Americans can have watched this show for 4 years and want 4 more years of it. And what that means, going back to something that Reiner said, yes, it's true that Trump makes his own reality. He's been telling us that. But 68 million Americans are in his reality. And I find that really devastating.
I'm quite sure that that's a theme and an issue that we'll come back to. So let me ask our final panelist, Michael Zorn, what's your verdict on what this election has done for the image of America?
You also asked to which extent do we agree, and there's at least one agreement. It's complicated.
Yes.
But I mean, because it is complicated, maybe I would just like to throw out 2 observations. One, where I would say this has really done bad to democracy, and the other one, which I found very surprising and very positive, and the very surprising and very positive one is the election day or the election night. It is the voter turnout, it is the civilized way of voting and waiting, and it is that something happened that most of us expected, that Trump will call early his victory, but then it happened something that at least I did not expect, that there was no support by Fox, that all the other media worked against the statement, and in that way the statement essentially evaporated. And that was for me a moment when I would say, well, that was surprising to me and very positively surprising. And together with the voter turnout and the civilized way of voting, I think that sent a strong positive message about democracy. The horrible message about democracy, and that is probably close to what Susan said, is there's a guy trailing behind 10%, and then he explains to the people, well, I won't accept the outcome if I do not win. And from that moment on, he wins back 5 or 6%. And that is, for me, the sort of most negative message about democracy that you can send, that you do not accept the procedure, and nevertheless, you get those votes from those 68 millions, or essentially every second of the voters.
Can you just clarify what you mean about getting back 5 or 6% by declaring he?
When he openly stated that he probably will not accept the election when he does not win, he was about 10% behind in the polls. And
so you're not talking about Tuesday night.
And now we are back to 2 or 3. So I mean, he obviously won back some votes in the last 4 weeks. And in a good democratic country, you should just expect that someone who says, I do not accept the outcome of the election, is out of the election. And here, essentially, the opposite happened, and that is something which is horrible for democracy.
That is certainly true. If you turn to Tuesday night, to the election day in this election week, or maybe it was actually Wednesday by the time he said it, he actually tried to lay claim to the election. He said, we were going to win and we have won, and was essentially trying to put a marker down that, any action by the other side or by the constitutional authorities to deprive him of his victory would be illegitimate. But the interesting thing was that many Republicans came out and said, this is wholly unacceptable, and he really undermined himself. For those of us who are in Europe and we're watching CNN International, which is probably the preferred broadcaster on most dials. It was striking that the former senator from Pennsylvania, who seldom has anything bad to say about Trump, Rick Santorum, really disagreed vehemently with him. So it's a very mixed picture we're getting of what we thought was a solid red line behind Donald Trump. Is it not, Reiner? What do you think?
Well, I agree with you that his denial of the procedure undermined himself in the eyes of many, including the media that kept supporting him. And so that is an interesting move because we all know that there's lots of things up for grabs in the United States, but the rule of law and some of the eternal laws, that's very hard to question. And so Donald Trump went out on a limb when he did that. But as Susan says, it is remarkable not just how many people still voted for Donald Trump, but how many even now, when they're being asked what you think about what's going on, actually do say and do think that there might be, could be, or is indeed some kind of fraud going on. So reality that Donald Trump produces is indeed the reality a lot of people, not most, or maybe most of the voters for Trump believe they are in. For us as students of legitimacy, it's an interesting moment because he's not declaring, as you correctly said, he's not declaring the whole voting procedure to be illegitimate. He says that what is going on now after the real vote, which he thinks has to be done on the Tuesday, what's going on now is not just that ballots are being counted that are fake ballots, but that actually more voting is still going on. I think that is what he said, because he didn't say stop counting. He said stop casting the vote. And so that is a serious thing. And I think his wager is, at the moment, how much he can still influence a large part of the public to take over this idea, to think themselves into this reality that actually there's a big fraud going on. I tend to think, as I said earlier, he will not be successful in that because the procedures and a lot of people in responsible positions seem to be resilient. But it is an interesting wager that he is offering to his people.
And it is very much the beginning of the story. It'll be a compressed story, we know, because of the constitutional requirements to certify electors and pick the next president. But it is certainly a very complicated and ambiguous situation. Ryan, Michael, I wanted to ask you a question. What, as a scholar of international relations and someone who's no doubt followed closely the ebb and flow of democracy in the world, we saw a huge wave of regimes becoming democratic in the 90s and early into the 21st century, and we've seen erosion since then. Do you think that this will have any ripple effect? Will this have any follow-on effects for other countries in the developing world, even in Europe?
I mean, it had already. Essentially, we see a downturn, a backsliding in the quality of democracy. If you take those measures that measure democracy globally, it is a process that started even before the election of Trump, but that has accelerated in the last 5 or 10 years. My personal view on that is, the thing that I fear most, essentially. I do think that under American leadership after World War II, the international order created something that Woodrow Wilson asked for, an international order that is safe for democracies. And that was essentially the frame condition under which we saw an enormous rise of consolidated liberal democracies after World War II. That is, I think, easily forgotten, that this success of democracies is not only due to all of those parallel internal developments, but is also due to an international order that made it possible. And with the undermination of this international order, and no question, no person was so effective in undermining parts of this international order than Donald Trump. With the undermination of this order, I think we will see a further acceleration in the backsliding of democracies.
Could Christoph Millers, you're an expert on constitutional law, constitutional courts. Everyone, I'm sure, is asking themselves the question of what's going to happen with the legal challenges. And at the moment, most of the commentary suggests that most of the legal challenges are fairly frivolous. But, if the court wants to intervene, the Supreme Court in the United States, if it comes down to one state, for example, they very well might. How do you analyze the current situation? Is it too early to say, or do you have concrete expectations?
Before we answer your question, perhaps let me just make one point to Michael's remark on the international order, because I think maybe we're a little bit overrating Trump here. I mean, we see that the election is a structural phenomenon. We see that Congress has, the Democrats have lost in the House, so there seems to be something more general going on. And with regard to the international order, I would still put my money on George W. Bush when it comes to the destruction of the international law. I think international law was really different after Bush. It was a different international law. I cannot say that at the moment with regard to Trump. We see a dissolution of international law because of the multipolarity of China. It's a different world now, but the contribution of America was much more destructive under Bush than it has been so far under Trump, for many reasons, not for goodwill, but as a result, I would just cling to that. With regard to the Supreme Court, it's very hard to tell, and I think there is a whole industry in the United States of basically, Supreme Court astrology. What you can, I think, see is that the Chief Justice has become something much more of an institutional player than before, and much less of a partisan player, because he probably sees that there's a fine line between doing something politicized and clothed into legal arguments and somehow wrecking the institution, which is then overtly politicized. And with the now really conservative court after the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, the distrust in the court is obviously much bigger than it has been before. But on the other hand, we see these people. We see that three justices were Republicans in the litigation of Bush versus Gore. We see that these people are really highly partisan. And it's not entirely clear that there will be a check on themselves. Maybe they just pull through, and if the right case comes in front of them, maybe there will be 5 votes to do something that looks very obscene to us so far. Again, I don't want to repeat that, but Bush v. Gore was a break with many traditional arguments, even coming from the Republican side. Federal intervention into a state electoral process. Something we wouldn't expect from Republican judges to do. They did it, and so far, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I wouldn't be so sure that this court is careful and that they are somehow waiting to define themselves and to settle in themselves, especially the three judges. It seems perfectly possible that they just jump in on a situation which they can assure Republican government.
I have a question for Susan, but before I put it to her, I just want to say that in a few minutes, 15 or so, we will begin taking questions from the audience. And I just want to say that if you are watching and you want to ask a question, please use the YouTube comments section. And some of our staffers who are here will curate those and get them to me, and I will put them to our panelists. I will do the best I can to ask as many as I can, but I apologize in advance for any disappointments. Susan, I saw a fascinating tweet earlier from a former Democratic governor of Wisconsin who, I don't know what the impetus was, but he tweeted, "I'm sorry, half of America is not made up of racists with contempt for the rule of law," and and then he rattled off 5 other epithets that are usually ascribed to Trump. What do you think of that? What do you think of this extraordinary support that this president has acquired?
Look, I think half is not enough, which is why I said I was devastated. Before I say something about that, I want to respond to Christoph. I really appreciate your reminding us that 4 years ago, there was pretty general agreement that George W. Bush was the worst president in American history. And the, the fact that he behaved like a gentleman while doing all kinds of things, I mean, both legally and internationally, has allowed us to forget just how much damage he caused. So I agree with you entirely. But I've also been thinking in the last 4 years about the wonderful quote of, I think it's La Rochefoucauld, that hypocrisy is the compliment vice pays to virtue. And we're better off with hypocrisy, in fact. What, you know, that's sort of the art of diplomacy. What Trump has done is, by breaking all of the norms, even when they're not, you know, I mean, basically, I don't know an American who really thought that Bush went to war in order to bring democracy to Iraq. A lot of Europeans thought he did that and then thought he was simply naive. It wasn't naivete, he didn't really believe that. But he had the concept that you do things for reasons other than naked self-interest and plunder. And by simply not recognizing that concept, both domestically and internationally, Trump has appealed to everybody's worst instincts in the way that Obama, quoting Lincoln, tried to appeal to the better angels of our nature. Trump really tells everyone, you know, just be as mean and vile as you want to. Nobody is really at bottom anything else, which his supporters actually like. And I think internationally, you've seen that effect already in people like Bolsonaro and Modi and Orban and so on. You know, even as people around the world talk about the end of the American century or the decline of empire and all of that, the American president, much more than parliament, I mean, who knows, unless you're a political scientist or you study it really carefully, you know at most the name of something about the leader of every country. You very rarely know anything about the composition of the Senate or the parliament. So the American president still has this role model function.
But isn't that somehow overestimating the United States? I must say, you know, Modi would have been elected in India without Trump. There's no doubt about that. But so I think, you know, that is not about the US. That is something that works differently, though with comparable results.
Yeah, you know, you can say that for every, you know, every single leader that I've named. And of course, it's much more complicated that Trump was elected and so Bolsonaro was elected. What I'm saying is that the way that he behaves on the world stage gives people permission to say, well, if the American president does that, hey, why can't I? So anyway, I'm not sure that I've answered your question, Daniel. I don't know if you want me to try still. Maybe I can just say one thing that I think has played a more important role in this election than anybody has noticed. I wrote a book arguing that America needs to have a racial reckoning with its violent past. That's now become almost a banal thing to say through a combination of events. What has not been done is a reckoning with the Cold War, so that when Fox News says Nancy Pelosi, of all people, is a socialist, that played a role in the Latino vote in Florida. You know, it played a role. Bernie Sanders is less of a socialist than Angela Merkel, if you actually look at his program. But his remarks about Cuba in March before the South Carolina primary were crucial to his losing the primary. So, I mean, that seems to me to be a factor that we really need to look at very carefully, the way, you know, what the picture of socialism as the absolute evil and the way that that can be weaponized in American politics is something we really need to deal with.
I think one of the interesting things is how prior to Trump, for a long time, you didn't hear that language, but it was, in a sense, latent in the public consciousness from the Cold War and was brought back. People were not talking about socialists. They had many things they didn't like about Barack Obama, but they weren't talking about socialism as much.
Sorry, they called him a socialist
Yeah.
many, many times.
So, Michael and then Reiner, it seems like everyone wants to come in on this one.
Right. I mean, just one more remark on this comparison between Trump and Bush on who did more damage to the international order. I mean, it's of course a competition of two giants in that respect. There's no question about that. But I mean, I still would argue there is a significant difference. And the difference is that no question, especially with the Iraq intervention, George Bush undermined the credibility of the United Nations Security Council and of the whole international security order. But that was a specific element of the international order, the international security order. What Trump did essentially, he extended it to everything, to the WTO, to environment and all that, and in addition to that, and that is for me the decisive issue, he essentially, with his extreme version of America First, he rejects any notion of the idea that there is anything like a global common interest, like a global good. And that's a huge difference to George W. Bush, who still maintained this idea. And if I may, since I speak already, I mean, in that respect, there's no question. Trump tries to speak to all of the worst instincts. But if we speak now about the American people, there's no question that this program of authoritarian populism consisting of, let's say, closed borders, of a sort of a rejection of international institutions, and also a notion of the public will is known by the president, that this sort of program has not been voted out by the people. I mean, the support is still enormous. We have to realize this. But then again, I would say it's maybe 25 to 35% of the American people. We should not forget America has a majoritarian voting system. And that means, of course, those people, if they want to not get in power, but if they want to have influence, they need to capture one of the two parties, and they have captured one of the two parties. In Europe, those 25 to 35% can vote for the AfD, can vote for Marine Le Pen, and so on. In that sense, I would maybe not expect that the difference in terms of the people is that enormous. I mean, there are probably more in the US than in Europe, but there's a very decisive factor, and that's the fact that they have captured the Republican Party because they could not create a new party.
Reiner, you wanted to come in on this point.
Yes, I agree with everything that has been said, but before we send Trump like a demon who has captured a people, we should also recognize that there are long-term trends, increasing long-term trends in American society that have led Trump. So for trends that look someone like Trump, he was just the ideal figure. Who exaggerated everything they looked for. They looked for someone who would build a wall, stop immigration. For someone who would finally say, "Oh, climate change, come on, we do fracking and many other things." Look for someone who would tell them to bully, if there's a word, Chinese, have a word with the EU, and tell the NATO people to get their act together and pay for their security. If you lived in the United States, as I've done many times, but also during the debates about Obamacare, and saw how the Tea Party captured town hall meetings and the courts, this as a socialist intervention into the freedom of Americans that would only benefit lazy and unfit people. And the racist undertone was obvious. You can't be surprised that someone like Trump, even though it is surprising at how many features into the wild he still has, but the core of what he gets across to his people is something wanted to hear for a long time.
So it falls to me as a former American diplomat and the leader of a nonpartisan institution to try to turn things on their head a little bit and say, okay, we may think it's grim out there, but in the spirit of the great German philosopher Hegel, Americans today are, according to all the polls, much more concerned about racial justice, much more supportive of immigration, much more interested in universal health care, and in general, much more supportive, according to the polls, of the rule of law. Should we be taking the long view and saying, yes, this is a difficult patch for the United States, but it won't be the first country to have had periods of disruption and in some ways institutional decay, but that in fact ultimately it's a democracy and it's going to master some of these big problems?
Daniel, that's what Barack Obama said exactly 4 years ago.
Well, I worked for him, so what can I say? I didn't claim to be original.
No. What I want to say is I didn't work for him, but I was on, the first campaign bus that went to New Hampshire in 2007. I'm still a huge fan of our former president. So my problem is I would love to believe you, and it was easier for me to believe him 4 years ago than it is now. Because once again, that 68 million people want to see the same show all over again has got to make us think that something has actually changed. I agree with you. I was thrilled about Black Lives Matter. You have 2/3 of American people and including more than half of white people talking about systemic racism. I agree. But I wonder if we're going to get anywhere if we don't do something about our media. And I think having spent a little time yesterday and today looking at Fox, which is a painful thing to do, but I'm trying to understand exactly what the alternative reality is. I can't be as Hegelian as you are today.
Okay, Mika, you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I just want to confirm and want to say that given the data that I know for a book that we recently did, also in that respect, the situation is probably pretty similar in Europe. People like gender equality, people like policies that are most often associated with the mainstream parties, but there is one issue where they are different, and that is a view on the political system as corrupt, as detached, as not hearing to those people who they are. And that is essentially the moment when they turn to those kind of authoritarian populist parties. It seems to me quite clear that there is very, very little support for the specific policies, with the slight exception of immigration policy. But even there it goes down. But if it comes to all other societal policies, there is support for the positions of the mainstream parties. But it is the belief that the political system is not working in their interest, it is corrupt, and they are detached, and they are those liberal cosmopolitans who do not hear to the simple people of the street. And that's similar in Europe than in the US.
Yeah,
but the
so
difference...
that actually, if I can just follow that up, part of that derives from the perception, often correct, but sometimes not, that there is perpetual gridlock in political systems, that they're not delivering the social goods for the people. We're about to see, it looks like, a Democratic president confronted by a Republican Senate. And I guess the question that I would put out to our panelists is this a recipe, is it necessarily a recipe for further disenchantment with our system? and is therefore a rather gloomy outlook. Christoph, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, well, 2 points. The first, chiming on Michael, I think maybe the difference still is between American, Tea Party or Republicans, Trumpists, on the one hand, and European right-wing authoritarians, that European right-wing authoritarians always try to abolish the whole system. While I would still say Trump may be a corrupt figure and he is really pushing the system to its limits, and there is a problem. But I don't see these people, somehow looking for another kind of constitution or looking for a non-Republican government, which is actually very much the program of Le Pen or of the AfD and so on and so forth. So the Americans have been knowing their system now for more than 200 years, and they have, much experiences with corruption. Basically, Lyndon B. Johnson got a Senate seat, through fraud and, vote early and often in the Kennedy election. There's always high degree of politicization and not so much of deviance within the system. But then again, there seems to be a very small but somehow detectable consensus about that the Republican Constitution there is the thing they all somehow agree upon. Not about how to understand it, how to interpret it, but that it is there. And while I think that's why I would trust much less in European constitutionalism and democracy, see movements that really want something completely different. Now, with regard to your question, obviously, yes, it's a late 18th century constitution, and its very aim is to block public action. There's freedom when the government cannot do anything, and it's I think a serious problem that you don't get rid of this structure. And to reform that thing might be good, but it's like reforming the United Nations; it just won't happen. And therefore, I think there's only the political pressure to get consensus within 2 chambers of the House to get something done. I don't see any other solution than a political for that, but it's a really serious institutional problem. And it's, in a way, a quaint constitution. Very nice, very interesting, but somehow very dysfunctional.
Yeah, so the 2 international relations guys sitting here in the WC Bay both believe that UN reform would be a lot easier than getting rid of the Electoral College. You make a very good point, and it is astonishing that we've had one Republican president in the last 40 years, 35 years, who won the popular vote, one administration, and I think that it is remarkable that we haven't seen more consequent action to reform the Electoral College or to adopt the program of having states vote the popular vote with their electors. That is, everyone would commit to vote according to the popular vote. But one party is deeply, deeply attached to the Electoral College right now, so the possibility of reform is really ruled out. Rainer, did you want to come in on this point as well?
Yes, I agree with the need for and the problems of having a real reform. I do not see it, not even a reform with respect to campaign finances, because as we know, there have been interpretations by the court that the use of money is the use of free speech in trying to win an election. So I'm also pessimistic about structural reform. I just would like to add a footnote to what Michael said and about our populism analysis. As much as I agree with everything usually that Michael says, I think here corruption of elite is one idea that people who vote for populists have, but we will not understand the viciousness, not just in America, but also in other countries with which populists are supported. If we do not understand that a part of the people who support them find themselves in a defensive war for upholding their life world as a white, male-dominated Christian life world that they fear is from being a majority now becoming a minority. If we do not understand all the ideas connected to that, in their view, defensive war, we will not understand what drives such populist movements, and also not why they forgive Trump many things that are unforgivable because they think one can use a small devil for fighting a bigger devil.
Yeah, so that's a really important point. The 2016 election, most of the best analysis has emphasized the issue of white anxiety. Most of the commentary in the run-up to 2020 said, actually that issue has receded and it's really all about Trump, it's about coronavirus, all the rest. I think what we have seen is actually that issue remains at the forefront. Susan, can you quickly come in and then I'm going to go to the audience?
Yeah, I actually have a question for you, Daniel.
Uh-oh.
Because as important as these structural issues are and racial questions, I think the last couple of elections have been extraordinarily personal. And for everyone I know, whether or not you disagreed with this or that particular policy, Barack Obama was the embodiment, the restoration of the American dream, okay? If you were going to build the opposite of Obama, if you just sat and tried to put it together, as a fiction, you would have Donald Trump. And he has very much behaved that way. What I find so really difficult to understand is how the same country that voted twice for Barack Obama, obviously there are people there, and it isn't, racism is just a word. It's not unpacking the whole thing. How they can love, and they do love, this guy who is the exact opposite of the president you served and I knocked on doors for, et cetera. How do you put that together?
I think that's a subject for a whole nother session. I would say just in capsule that the fact, these aren't frozen realities. I think it was the experience of the Obama administration for many people who had latent anxiety about becoming a minority, together with lots of immigration going on. It was actually a catalytic thing, and there has been a lot of polling done on the extent to which white people, especially whites in non-urban areas, felt that the benefits of government were no longer going to them and were in fact going to minorities, and that had a really galvanizing impact on the Tea Party and ultimately Trump supporters. And Reiner is nodding, so I'm hoping that that's enough, and I can go on to the questions that are pouring in. We're not going to get to them all. So here's a question. I think, Michael, this one has your name on it, but it also has Christoph's name on it. Let's see. What will change for the transatlantic partnership and global challenges with a Biden administration that is in gridlock because it doesn't control the Congress?
The Senate or the Congress is obviously most important for bigger structural reforms in the inside. So, in that respect, for international policies and for taking back, for example, the exit from the Paris Treaty and so on, Joe Biden can do something. But regarding this question that pops up now again, that the basic American interests, Nord Stream 2, trade and all this will remain the same. There's no question these interests probably remain to a significant extent the same. But as we IR people always argue, one thing are the conflicts, and the other way is the way you handle those conflicts, conflict management, and that is something that will change. After all, there is some concerns regarding trade of the Americans that can be easily understood, but the way Trump handled it, that he essentially ignored the WTO and did all of it bilaterally. And that will probably change with Biden. He will defend American interests in international trade, there's no question. And that will probably apply to many other issues as well. So, there will be ongoing fundamental problems between Europe and the US, and there will be a limited way what he can do of rebuilding the international order, but it will make a difference.
Christoph, I wanted to ask you because, again, you're a constitutional scholar. The president has considerable latitude in foreign affairs in a way that he doesn't in domestic policy. So what is your view about Biden's room for action in terms of reaffirming the transatlantic relationship and doing any number of things on the multilateral stage, even if he is going to be challenged by having the Senate in the hands of the opposition party?
Well, I think it just refers to the distinction Michael has made before with regard to, in a way, diplomacy and the way people treat each other. The president has a wide latitude. With regard to entering into treaties, obviously the Senate has a very strong role, and there are many constellations still thinkable in which the Senate could somehow spoil the renewal of the international order. I must say the hard question I can't really answer, and I would have to check, is if they can really re-enter the Paris Accord without consent of the Senate. They probably can. So that is good news. The other things that has happened so far somehow were within a given treaty system, so that Biden can do a lot with regard to that. So basically, I'm rephrasing Michael's correct answer to that.
Yeah, I think as a practical matter, since we got into the Paris Accord as an executive agreement in the same way we got into the Iran nuclear deal, we can re-enter. But that doesn't mean that the Senate will ever appropriate money for us to fulfill our obligations. Moving on, another question. Social media has been under intense scrutiny, and of course, considerable resources have been invested in social media for information operations before, during, and after Election Day. I'm curious if you think that social media has had a particularly important role in the kind of normative decay that we have seen and the challenges that we are facing in terms of populism, Trump, and so on. Rainer, do you want to take a crack at Susan, go ahead.
Well, yes, of course, it's been a problem, but I'd like to take, remind people once again of the importance of Fox. If you haven't been in certain parts of the country, you don't realize how ubiquitous it is. Yeah. It's almost impossible to get away from. Yeah. And a friend of mine is starting a campaign to defund Fox, which is more, it's more interesting the longer you watch Fox. That is, it's not only a hotbed of misinformation. I can't watch it long enough to figure exactly what the ratio of commercials to, non-commercials is, but it's huge. And it's almost as important as whatever they're getting. There's a kind of blur that you get from, I saw today an ad for medication for schizophrenia, for dog treats, for, it just goes on and on and on. And pressure on companies that advertise with Fox could really make a difference. I mean, we've seen proposals about Elizabeth Warren about regulating social media, and I think, that's quite interesting. But the most watched source of information in the country is Fox News.
Yeah.
Well, so there have been many efforts to boycott different advertisers of Fox, and they've been very successful, actually. Tucker Carlson, I know, has had a terrible time holding on to sponsors because things that he has said has led to tremendous pressure on those firms. But Rainer, do you want to comment on social media as a divisive force or as a constructive force in democracy today?
Well, in typical Frankfurt dialectic terms, it can be both, right? In a media situation like Susan is describing, having independent media being set up by certain groups can be very useful to distribute information. But of course, people develop their communication in communication bubbles, and so they tend to reiterate only hearing certain information. What I wanted to add was that Trump is really a remarkable phenomenon. If you study authoritarian politics or authoritarian charisma in social media time. Because we often laugh and wonder about what he does with his tweets. But what he really does is connect personally with millions of people, getting political messages across that he couldn't get across in official media, not even in Fox News. And I think this is part of the secret of Trump. He lets people participate in his thoughts, sometimes half-baked thoughts, sometimes wild and vicious thoughts, but that's exactly what connects them to him as a person. And so this truly, I think, played a huge role in this campaign. Politicians like Biden could never do what Trump does on social media.
You know, you bring up a really interesting point. I think many of us were looking at the 2020 elections and thinking that it would be the continuation of the 2018 election, and there would be a big repudiation of Trumpism, much as we saw in the congressional elections. But Trump himself is a profound figure and a unique figure who has changed all the dynamics. And so I think that what you're saying is quite on point. And, you know, I'm personally not necessarily touched by the charisma there, but his authenticity is really quite remarkable to a lot of people, which is, on the one hand, yes, remarkable. On the other hand, that kind of connection is rather scary.
Isn't that the commonality? I mean, because Susan asked for it, of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, that these are two figures which are charismatic, which are show talents, and isn't that a feature of the American political system, that they produce much more often those people than, let's say, a simple parliamentary system, which produces the Helmut Kohls and Angela Merkels, which certainly have much less of such a show person talent than those two. I mean, there may be a sort of a similarity, and that may explain to some extent this very fascinating and intriguing question: how can a country vote twice for Barack Obama and then almost twice for Donald Trump? And that may be a sort of a commonality which is important. And if I may add to this Fox News thing, I mean, of course, Fox News is important and is also in terms of direct influence very important. But I would highlight, again, Rainer's point. I mean, the difference in Europe may be that those independent news still have some authority as referees. And there, of course, Donald Trump was in 2016 extremely successful in essentially arguing all those CNN, New York Times, and so on news are partisan. They are not neutral. And in that sense, I mean, he killed this sort of independent agency that plays some sort of role of judging, of refereeing these different echo chambers in the social media, and that may be a huge difference. I mean, BBC is something good to have, to put it in those words.
But the New York Times is not the BBC.
I'm sorry.
It was there before, you know, just to say that. I mean, I have a subscription to the New York Times, but I would never take the New York Times to be a referee. You know, it's a liberal paper, and it's not Trump that abolished that. It's basically, you know, the deregulated the media and so on and so forth. It's a long history, and I think Trump didn't really contribute. He made use of it, but the destruction of lack of representation with that is, I think, much earlier.
Because we have no public media.
Yes, that is it.
All of our media, with you know, the laughable exception of NPR and you know, which almost nobody watches. All of our media is commercial, which is why, I mean, rather than boycotting Tucker Carlson, one or two particularly egregious shows of Fox News, the point would be to boycott all advertisers of Fox News. And but also to talk about the benefits and the possibilities of a public media system like the one we have in Germany, with all of its faults, I'm happy to pay my, Gebühr, even though I don't watch it very often. I'm happy to pay it.
Just one sentence to be clear on that. What I mean, I'm happy that we have public media, and I know that the US does not have it. But I mean, what I would observe compared to the 90s and the 1980s when I was in the US, there was still a sort of authority for ABC News, for CBS News, as a sort of independent authority and source, in spite of the fact that they were private companies. And this has been lost. And that is the difference that happened over time, independent of the structural question of public or not public.
Well, that was largely the result of the rise of cable. Yeah.
Right. Can I add?
I'd like to just ask you each to have one brief closing remark on your predictions going forward. You've already delivered some of them, but I'm sure that you have more. So, Christoph, why don't we start with you? You had your hand up.
Well, I was just fascinated by Susan's question to you about, how does that work, Obama and then Trump. And perhaps we should a little bit look for the exotization of Trump and say, normally a sitting president is reelected. A sitting president is normally reelected when the economy runs well. And normally one party doesn't get 3 terms at a row. And if we look to these very old rules, which basically worked out after Roosevelt, everything seems relatively normal. And the fact that Trump probably will not be reelected is something rather unusual. And therefore something we could, see as remarkable in itself. Maybe we are doing him a favor when we try to, find ad hoc rules for him. And maybe we should somehow rather sort him in to presidential politics of American 20th century and to understand better what is going on, because it's still fascinating that we all misinterpreted, the polls were relatively wrong, and we misinterpreted the COVID crisis, its meaning for the election, and so on and so forth. So we don't really know what is going on. Maybe we should stick to old recipes and rules to interpret the political process.
Well, there's certainly an awful lot to be humble about. Susan, did you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I have to disagree with Christoph a little bit here. I remember that the mantra when Trump was elected 4 years ago was, don't normalize this. This is not a normal presidency. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was absolutely right, and I said it myself for quite some time. The problem is, as he violated one norm after the next and produced one thing that shocked us so much that we forgot the shocking thing that happened 3 days ago, it was extremely hard to keep that sense of outrage. It becomes normal. I mean, what you get used to over 4 years becomes normal. So I suppose, as far as predictions, I fear, and I'm normally a very hopeful person. This is the darkest I have ever seen things in my whole life, probably. I fear we're going to have a Biden presidency, but a Republican-dominated Senate, even if we squeak by with one extra senator. And I guess I would urge us to try to remember, not to put this phenomena in, oh, well, history zigs and zags and it goes back and forth. This is not a normal way of reasonable democracy.
I think it's Reiner, it's over to you.
Yeah, I agree that the phenomena we've been talking about will remain with us, even if, as I think he will, Trump loses his last battle, which is these days. He can still do a lot of mischief until January, but I think many of the phenomena, including the radicalism of the political right, will remain with us within the Republican Party. This will not disappear within a few months. One last word, if I may, because Christoph mentioned it, but we haven't talked about the pandemic in our discussion, which prevents us from being in the same room, unfortunately. I think you may disagree, but I think without the pandemic, this election wouldn't have gone as it did. I think without the pandemic, Trump would have been reelected on the basis of the economic figures had they not plummeted, and had he not denied the reality of corona and asked people not to wear masks, which worked with a lot of people who supported him and are corona skeptics. But I think overall, this pandemic has damaged his reputation to some extent, and also has brought about a crisis in which he acted very unfortunately. And so without the pandemic, this may be the only good thing one can say about it. This election would have gone differently.
So Rainer is a Hegelian because you mentioned Hegel, so that's the reason why we got the virus. I agree with all what has been said, and therefore, I mean, I just want to remind all of us, it's not over, right? I mean, we assume currently that Biden is president and ask what will happen then. And I just want to recall this piece by Barton Gellman, your colleague and friend, that in the Atlantic that shocked at least all Europeans very much. And I mean, just recalling it, he was talking about 3 stages of undermining the Constitution. The first stage was calling an early victory. That failed. The second stage are the lawsuits. Well, he seems to be very weak on that side, but let's see. And there's a third stage that he mentions, and the third stage is manipulating, bribing, playing strange game with the Electoral College. And I mean, if Biden wins only with 270 Electoral College votes, then I think this is this third stage is then the one which may cause the highest likelihood of success. And if that happens, then maybe in January there is no president.
Well, that's a bracing way to end. So let me just say in brief conclusion. So for those who weren't aware, our 3 German panelists are, they should be out there in the sun in Los Angeles, thinking big thoughts and working on a book together while enjoying the surf as well. I'm curious, I'm very curious to see the book and to see if there was, if we could detect a climatic difference in the way it came out, because you weren't at Villa Aurora writing it. But I'm curious if any one of you wants to just, I'm sure I'm throwing dynamite on this one, but if any one of you wants to give us a précis of the work and how it might have been influenced by the events of the last few days. Yeah, you have to sort it out among yourselves. You're co-authors. This is the sort of thing that goes with the territory. Rainer, it's over to you. Michael gave it to you. He dropped the phone, so it was different impulses, but go ahead.
Right. Now, our project will be changing forms of legitimacy as our societies change and also the international order. So I think what we're just witnessing is an interesting test case. What does democratic legitimacy actually mean? It has a number of components. One is the procedural component that we talked about, but also popular support is an essential component of democratic legitimacy. So Trump is violating democratic norms of legitimacy, but he's also claiming a higher form of legitimacy, what he does, and for the interests that he represents. And I think it's an extreme case, but it is an interesting case because political systems, democratic political systems, cannot without the popular power and support of movement, of parties, and so on. So a procedural answer for the question of legitimacy is an important answer. A legal answer is an important answer. But a lot of what's going on in a democratic public that belongs to the question of legitimacy. And also, I can't speak about the international order, but I think that Trump has changed that order, and the question of legitimacy, of legitimate suit of self-interest is on the agenda in the international order, and whether frameworks inhibit that, and if they do, they should be changed. So power politics within states and beyond states as a question of legitimacy will be very much on our mind.
Well, it sounds like a great project, and I hope that we can reconvene. You'll be done in a year, right? In a year or 2 years' time to examine and discuss the results. I want to close by again thanking Villa Aurora, the Thomas Mann House, for being a great co-sponsor and co-architect of this event, together with the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. And I just want to say we can all now go back to checking the counts, the ballot counts, compulsively. I just did so, and we are where we were at the beginning of this event in terms of no more states being called. But I want to thank you all for tuning in, and again, good luck, and we look forward to talking again when this is all over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.